Hello, everybody. This is Daniel, nurse with Apollo 1. I would like to talk with you briefly today about organophosphate poisoning. I like to make things brief when I can, so the shortest version of this came up when I was telling Mr. Reel that I'd be doing this presentation, and he said, organophosphate poisoning, atropine, atropine, atropine. And that really is the long and short of it. You could probably stop this presentation right now and do okay. But if you'd like to learn a little more, let's go a little further. So how bad is the problem? Organophosphates are the most common pesticidal agent. In the United States, we see about 3,000 exposures a year, leading to about 15 deaths a year. So it is a relatively rare problem, but still important to know how to treat. And also important to know that organophosphates are commonly used as a method of suicide attempt in agricultural areas, which we are in. And you are, in fact, much more likely, if you are taking care of a patient with organophosphate poisoning, it is much more likely to be from a suicide attempt than it is from an accidental exposure. About twice as likely. Okay, and so how specifically do organophosphates kill? Well, three primary ways. Through creating excess bronchial secretions to where the patient essentially drowns in their own secretions. By creating respiratory depression and paralysis. Okay, just so you have an idea, what are some of the common organophosphates? There are some insecticides, some being parathion and malathion, some herbicides such as tribufos or murfos. And I did read that there are household agents that include organophosphates. I tried to find some brand names for you all, but I was not able to when I was looking online. But just know that it is possible to get an organophosphate poisoning from household pesticides. And a final class are nerve gases, such as sarin and the VX gas, real nasty stuff. Okay, so how do people get exposed? Like we kind of talked about, it can be work-related exposures, it can be household exposures, and then methods that they can get into your system. They can get in through ingestion, through inhalation, or just by touching. Okay, so how do organophosphates work? So the primary thing that they do that we care about is they inhibit acetylcholinesterase. So if you recall from medical suffixes that if you see esterase, we're talking about an enzyme that breaks something down. So in this case, this enzyme breaks down acetylcholine. All right, so the organophosphate is inhibiting the breakdown of acetylcholine. Therefore, your end result is too much acetylcholine. And that is the problem we are dealing with in organophosphate poisoning, is the patient having excess acetylcholine. Important to note that this process is reversible with early treatment. It becomes less reversible as time passes. So I know we treat all of our patients in a time-sensitive manner, but that is just one reason that these patients especially require prompt transport and treatment. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what is acetylcholine. It is a neurotransmitter. And what does it do? Well, that is hard because it does a bunch of stuff. The more I researched, the more things I learned about it, and the more I found that it does. It really would be quite a rabbit hole to talk about everything it does. But for example, it works in both the central and peripheral nervous systems, works in both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Is a neuromodulator, so it can have neurological effects, and it is essential for skeletal muscle action. And we'll talk more about the symptoms that it creates. But in short, it does all kinds of things throughout the body. A lot of times you will see it specifically referred to as the primary neurotransmitter of the autonomic nervous system. I think that is because the autonomic nervous system is the one that creates the characteristic kind of textbook symptoms of cholinergic toxicity or organophosphate poisoning. So let's talk about those symptoms. Okay, and on this slide and the next one, I have broken it up according to the how the symptoms arise, whether they arise from the muscarinic or nicotinic acetylcholine receptors in the body. And the reason for that is that, so for example, the symptoms we're going to see on this page, the muscarinic symptoms, these are the ones that respond to atropine. And that's really what we care about is, what can we do and what can we expect to see in response to our treatments. So these symptoms can be improved with atropine. So we have the typical sludge symptoms: salivation, lacrimation, urination, defecation, GI motility, and emesis. And sometimes you'll see it as sludge BBB because the B's are bronchuria, bronchospasm, and bradycardia. I also just added on there that you can also see constricted pupils as part of the muscarinic symptoms. So all of these we would like and expect to see improvement after giving atropine. Okay, so then the nicotinic receptors are the symptoms that arise from that. We have respiratory depression. These first three sort of go together, and weakness and paralysis. And these are related because, like I said, acetylcholine is essential for muscle activity. And so if the respiratory muscles become very weak, then we'll see the respiratory depression. And what's important to note is that these symptoms, we would not expect atropine to improve. So if you are caring for a patient who's had an organophosphate poisoning and they are having profound respiratory depression, it will not benefit them in that symptom to be given atropine. And those patients, you would really want to proceed to early intubation. But so a few more symptoms. You can also see fasciculations, muscle twitching, tachycardia, and dilated pupils. And those last two I put on there just to emphasize how difficult our job is. So this poisoning, it could cause bradycardia or it could cause tachycardia. It could cause constricted pupils or it could cause dilated pupils. Just keep things tricky so we stay on our toes. And finally, since it is a neuromodulator, you can see neurological symptoms such as those. And important to note that symptoms can occur as long as weeks after exposure to the organophosphate. Okay, so I've mentioned a little bit, but we'll go into more detail. How do we treat organophosphate poisoning? So, atropine. And so what atropine does is it competes for the muscarinic acetylcholine receptors. So those receptors are trying to be filled up with all this excess acetylcholine. If atropine can get there first and occupy the receptors, then the acetylcholine can't, and we won't have as many cholinergic symptoms. So our protocol is for 2 milligrams IV every 2 to 3 minutes, and you do that until their symptoms improve, and with really no maximum dose. The symptoms we're specifically looking for are most importantly, the respiratory symptoms. We want to hear their lung sound clear. We want to see fewer secretions, like gurgling in the throat, frothing at the mouth. We want to see fewer signs of respiratory distress, tachypnea, so forth. And so you just keep going with the atropine until their respiratory symptoms improve. So, important to note, at this dosage of 2 milligrams in our medication bags, we will only have 8 doses worth of atropine. I have read stories in my research of hospitals that have exhausted their entire supply of atropine on a single organophosphate poisoning patient. So this is just to emphasize that if you're picking a patient up from a sending hospital, you might want to see if they could give you some extra atropine to go with, or if there's an EMS, you're picking up from an EMS or something like that, see if they have any spare atropine they could give you, because you may well need it, because these patients are likely to need very high doses of atropine. Also, atropine has a duration of action of about 30 to 60 minutes, so you could conceivably give high doses and then have it wear off. Another dosing regimen for the critically ill patient that I've read about a lot, I came across was a doubling dosing regimen, where every dose you double what you gave the previous time and keep doing that until their symptoms resolve. And you can imagine that this would burn through a huge amount of atropine, and you would probably definitely want to talk with medical control on the phone before initiating that sort of regimen. I'll talk briefly about the pediatric dosing. Our protocol, I'd encourage everyone to read it. I tried to simplify it just a little bit. There's really, at its most basic in our protocol, the pediatric dosing has a single cut point of 2 years old. So at less than 2 years old, be giving 0.02 milligrams per kilogram IV. And that is easy to remember because that is the same dosage that we would give for symptomatic bradycardia in a pediatric patient. So same dosage there, nothing new to memorize there in less than 2 years old. Greater than 2 years old, you give 1 to 2 milligrams IV. Our protocol breaks it down a little bit more than that, but at its most basic, these are the important dosages to know. And you can give that every 10 minutes as opposed to every 2 to 3 minutes in the adult patient. Okay, another medicine, I'm going to breeze through this, pralidoxime, because we don't carry it. But this is the other important medicine as far as an antidote to organophosphate poisoning. And so what it does is it unbinds the organophosphates from the acetylcholinesterase. It can only do this in the short period of time after the exposure. It becomes less and less able to do this as their binding becomes more irreversible. So that's why we got to rush the patient on. And just so you know, initial treatment is 1 to 2 grams IV, and it definitely has to be given very slow. If it's given fast, it can kill the patient, cause cardiac arrest. Benzodiazepines, you just give them if the patient has seizures. Succinylcholine, so are we going to give this? We are not going to give this to these patients if they have to be intubated. The reason is that Sux is metabolized by acetylcholinesterase. So if the organophosphate is inhibiting the acetylcholinesterase, then it won't be able to metabolize the Sux. Sux will last much longer than we want it to. And for an example, I read a case of a pediatric patient who had organophosphate poisoning, given succinylcholine, and was paralyzed and apneic for 7 hours. Okay, last slide. Just don't forget, medical control would always be our first step, but don't forget that we have a fantastic resource in poison control. If you need them, just to get their input, they are available, of course, 24/7 to anyone, and use them if you need them. All right, thank you all so much.